my dear traveler. Come closer to the fire. The autumn winds are particularly restless tonight, aren't they? I can hear them whispering through the old oak trees, carrying stories of their own from distant lands. I remember now, you want to hear a tale. Here, let me pour you some chamomile tea, with just a touch of honey from the bees that nest in my garden wall. The fire is warm tonight, casting those familiar dancing shadows on the stone walls. Tonight I wish to tell you of something most peculiar that happened to me. It was a tale of sleep, my dear friend, not the gentle, restorative sleep we crave after a long day, but something far more mysterious, a sleep that lasted 100 years, affecting an entire village of good folk who had done nothing more than live their simple, honest lives. Yes, the village that slept for 100 years. That's what the traveling merchants came to call it, though they spoke of it only in hushed whispers. Most believed it to be nothing more than a tale to frighten children or entertain guests at taverns. But I had the extraordinary fortune, or perhaps misfortune, to stumble upon it myself. So brew yourself a cup of something warm. Pull that blanket a little closer and let me tell you of Valdris, a village lost to time, and how a simple act of curiosity can sometimes change the fate of an entire community. It was late spring, I recall, when I first heard whispers of Valdris. I had been traveling through the Whispering Peaks, those ancient mountains that rise like sleeping giants between the kingdoms of Theron and Aldemir. The snow had only just begun to melt, revealing paths that had been hidden for months beneath winter's white embrace. I was making my way to visit an old friend, a mountain hermit named Erasmus, who collected rare crystals and knew more about geological formations than any scholar in the great libraries. But as these things often happen during my wanderings, I became, shall we say, delightfully lost. You must understand, my dear traveler, that becoming lost is sometimes the universe's way of guiding you exactly where you need to be. I've learned not to fight these gentle redirections of fate. I had been following what I thought was the main mountain path, but it had gradually narrowed and twisted until I found myself walking along a barely visible deer track through dense pine forests. The air was thick with the scent of pine sap and wild mountain flowers, those tiny blue ones that peek through the snow like scattered sapphires. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, I realized I would need to find shelter for the night. That's when I saw it. A thin column of smoke rising in the distance, barely visible against the darkening sky. Smoke meant people, and people meant warmth, perhaps a hot meal, and certainly directions back to a proper road. So I adjusted my pack, gripped my walking staff a little tighter, and made my way toward that promising wisp of smoke. The path led me down into a small valley, hidden so completely by the surrounding peaks that you could walk within a stone's throw of it and never know it existed. Ancient spruce trees formed natural walls around this secret place, their branches so thick they created a canopy that filtered the fading sunlight into gentle golden streams. And there, nestled in the heart of this hidden valley like a jewel in a protective setting, was the village of Valdres. Now, at first glance, it appeared to be a perfectly ordinary mountain village. Perhaps 30 or 40 modest homes built of local stone and timber, their roofs covered in slate that had been quarried from the mountainside. A small stone bridge crossed a bubbling creek that wound through the center of the settlement. There was a village green with an old oak tree at its center, a blacksmith shop with its forge cold and dark, a small chapel with a bell tower, and what appeared to be a modest inn. But as I drew closer, something began to feel wrong. Not frightening, you understand, but deeply, profoundly strange. The smoke I had seen was rising from several chimneys, suggesting people were home and preparing evening meals. Yet I could hear no sounds, no children playing in the streets, no clatter of tools from the blacksmith's forge, no evening conversations drifting from open windows. The silence was so complete it seemed to have weight to it, like a heavy blanket that muffled even my own footsteps. I called out a friendly greeting as I entered the village proper. "Hello, good evening to you. Might a weary traveler find a warm meal and perhaps directions?" My voice seemed to be swallowed by the strange silence. Not even an echo returned to me. I approached the first house I came to, a cozy cottage with window boxes that should have been bright with spring flowers, but instead held only withered stems from seasons long past. I knocked on the sturdy wooden door, waited, then knocked again more loudly. No answer. The door was unlocked. Mountain folk are trusting that way, so I pushed it open and called inside. "Hello, is anyone home? I don't mean to intrude, but..." What I saw inside that cottage, my dear friend, was something I shall never forget as long as I live. A family of 4 was seated around their dinner table, a man with calloused hands and laugh lines around his eyes, wearing a wool vest that his wife had probably knitted for him. Beside him sat a woman with greying hair pinned back neatly, her hand resting on a ceramic serving dish. Across from them, 2 children, a boy of perhaps 10 years and a girl who couldn't have been more than 7. They appeared to be in perfect health. Their cheeks had colour. Their clothes were clean and well mended, not the natural sleep of people who had dozed off after a large meal, but something deeper, something that seemed to reach into their very souls. Their breathing was so slow and gentle that I had to watch carefully to see their chests rise and fall. The children's heads were resting peacefully on their folded arms, as if they had simply laid their heads down for a moment and never lifted them again. I reached out carefully and touched the man's shoulder, called his name, though I didn't know his name, of course. I tried gently shaking his arm. Nothing. It was as if they existed in a world completely separate from our own, unreachable across an invisible barrier. Deeply unsettled, but not yet understanding what I had discovered, I left that cottage and began checking others. House after house revealed the same impossible scene. A baker, his hands still dusted with flour, sleeping peacefully beside an oven that somehow continued to burn without tending. A mother nursing an infant, both lost in the same mysterious slumber, the child's tiny fingers curled around a wooden toy. The village blacksmith slept standing at his anvil, hammer in hand, positioned as if he had been about to strike heated metal when the strange sleep claimed him. Yet his forge continued to burn with that steady flame that produced the smoke I had seen from the mountains. By the time I had checked every dwelling in Valdris, I had counted 92 souls, from the oldest grandfather to the youngest babe, all trapped in this inexplicable slumber. The village functioned as if by magic. Fires burned without being tended, food remained fresh, even the flowers in some gardens continued to bloom despite being untended for what was clearly a very long time. Forgive me, dear traveller. The tea was rather warm and I needed to let it cool just a touch. Now, where was I? Yes. I had discovered this sleeping village, but I hadn't yet understood the true nature of what had befallen these good people. I spent that first night in the village inn, though calling it staying at an inn feels rather strange when the innkeeper and his entire family were deep in enchanted sleep. The rooms were clean and comfortable, the beds made with fresh linens that somehow never seemed to collect dust or lose their pleasant lavender scent. But sleep eluded me that first night. I sat by the window in my small room, looking out over the moonlit village, trying to understand what I had stumbled upon. The logical part of my mind, the part trained in various magical arts and ancient lore, began to suspect that this was no ordinary occurrence. The fact that daily necessities continued without human tending suggested powerful magic was at work here. When dawn broke over the whispering peaks, casting long shadows across the village green, I decided to explore the surrounding area. Perhaps there were clues to be found outside the village proper. I spent the morning walking the perimeter of the valley, examining the forest, the creek, the mountain paths. It was near midday when I encountered another soul who was very much awake, a grizzled hunter with keen eyes and a gentle manner, carrying a brace of mountain rabbits. His name was Fedor, and he had been hunting in these mountains for the better part of 40 years. When I told him about the sleeping village, he nodded grimly and settled down on a fallen log to share what he knew. "Aye, stranger," he said in a voice roughened by mountain winds and years of calling to his hunting dogs. "I've known about Valdris for near on 30 years now. Found it much the same way you did, following smoke on a cold winter's day." Fedor told me that he had spoken with other travelers over the years, merchants, fellow hunters, even a scholar or two who had heard the rumors and come seeking answers. All had found the same thing: a village locked in timeless sleep, sustained by magic none could understand or break. "But here's the curious thing," Fedor continued, pulling out a pipe and beginning to fill it with tobacco. "Old Henrik from the village down in the lowlands, he remembers Valdris from when he was a boy. Says it was a thriving place back then, maybe 70-odd years ago. They used to come down to the lowland markets every few months, selling their mountain honey and fine wool, buying supplies they couldn't make themselves." He struck a match and puffed his pipe to life before continuing. "Then one summer they just stopped coming. No one thought much of it at first. Mountain folk are independent, and sometimes villages become more isolated as old folk pass and young ones move away. But when several seasons passed with no word, Hendrik's father sent men up to check on them. They found the village just as you see it now. Every soul asleep, everything preserved as if by magic. That was over 70 years ago, friend. These people have been sleeping for at least a century. Fedor and I spent the afternoon together, and I found him to be a man of practical wisdom and honest character. He had developed a strange kind of guardianship over the sleeping village over the years, checking on it periodically to ensure no harm came to the slumbering residents. "I've tried everything I could think of," he admitted as we walked back toward the village as the sun began to set. Loud noises, cold water, even brought a priest up here once who tried various blessings and prayers. Nothing wakes them, but nothing seems to harm them either. It's as if they exist in a bubble outside of normal time. That evening, we sat together in the village square, sharing a simple meal that Fedor had prepared. The absurdity of cooking and eating in a village full of sleeping people was not lost on either of us, but there was something peaceful about it as well. It was Fedor who first mentioned the mountain cave. "There's something else," he said quietly, gazing up at the peaks that surrounded the valley. "About 5 years after I first found this place, I was hunting higher up the mountain, following a particularly clever stag, when I came across a cave I'd never seen before. Carved into the rock face, with symbols around the entrance that looked, well, they looked like they might mean something to someone who understands such things." He pointed to a distant peak, barely visible in the gathering twilight. Up there, maybe half a day's climb, the local folk, the ones from the lowland villages, they call it the Forbidden Cave, say it's been sealed for generations, protected by old magic that shouldn't be disturbed. The word forbidden has always held a particular fascination for those of us who study the magical arts. Not because we wish to meddle with dangerous forces, you understand, but because forbidden often means important and powerful. I asked Fedor to show me this cave the next morning, and he agreed, though with some reluctance. "I've never gone inside," he warned me. "Something about the place. It feels like a tomb, like disturbing it might wake something better left sleeping. But if you think it might help these poor folk." We set out at first light, following a steep mountain path that wound through groves of pine and aspen, across streams swollen with snowmelt, and up rocky slopes where mountain goats watched us with curious, intelligent eyes. The climb took us most of the morning. As we ascended, the air grew thinner and cleaner, carrying the scent of snow and stone and the wild herbs that grow only at high altitudes. Below us, the valley containing Valdres grew smaller and smaller, until it looked like a child's toy village nestled among the peaks. The cave, when we finally reached it, was unmistakably magical in origin. It had been carved, not by natural forces of water and wind, but deliberately shaped by intelligent hands. The entrance was perfectly circular, about the height of a tall man, framed by intricate symbols that had been etched deep into the living rock. These weren't random decorations, but a form of written language, though not one I immediately recognized. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn, my dear friend. As I studied those ancient symbols, running my fingers over the deep grooves worn smooth by centuries of mountain weather. I began to understand their meaning. They told of a guardian stone placed within the cave by the first inhabitants of this region to protect the valleys below from an ancient curse. The stone had been charged with protective magic by a circle of druids, sealed within the cave with powerful wards, and was never to be removed, lest the protection fail and dark magic be released upon the land. Fedor and I exchanged glances. The implication was clear. Someone had taken the guardian stone, and its removal had triggered exactly the kind of curse that had befallen Valdris. "We need to go inside," I told him. The cave extended much deeper into the mountain than its modest entrance suggested. We had brought torches, and their flickering light revealed a tunnel that descended gradually, carved from the living rock with the same precision as the entrance. The walls were covered with more of the ancient script, telling the history of the valley and the magic that protected it. Deep within the mountain, the tunnel opened into a circular chamber, its domed ceiling disappearing into darkness above our heads. And there, in the exact center of the chamber, was an empty pedestal. The guardian stone was gone, but scattered around the pedestal were clear signs of who had taken it and when. Footprints in the dust, fairly recent. A piece of torn cloth caught on a sharp edge of rock, and most tellingly, a small brass button that had come from a butcher's apron. I recognized the distinctive design that butchers use to keep their aprons secure while working. Fedor knew immediately who it must have been. "Halimir," he said grimly, "the butcher's son from Valdris. Boy of about 17 when the village fell asleep. Always was too curious for his own good, always poking around in places he shouldn't be." The story became clear to us then. Young Halimir, probably bored by village life and drawn by tales of the forbidden cave, had made the dangerous climb and somehow managed to bypass the protective wards that should have kept the stone safe. Perhaps he had been looking for treasure, or maybe just satisfying his curiosity. But his actions had doomed his entire village to a century of magical sleep. "The question now," I said to Fedor as we made our way back down the mountain, "is where did Halimir take the stone? And more importantly, can we find it and return it to break the curse?" The answer to the first question came to us that very evening. We had returned to the village as the sun was setting, both of us deep in thought about how to proceed. I decided to search Halimir's family home more carefully, looking for any clues about where a 17-year-old boy might have hidden a magical artifact. The house was modest, like all the others in Valdris. Halimir's parents, the village butcher and his wife, sat at their kitchen table, hands folded as if in prayer, caught in the same peaceful sleep as all the others. But upstairs, in what was clearly the young man's room, I found what I was looking for. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard was a wooden box containing various treasures that a young man might collect. Interesting stones, a few coins, pressed flowers, and most importantly, a journal written in Halimir's own hand. The final entry, dated exactly 100 years ago, read, "I did it. I actually found the forbidden cave and took the guardian stone. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, like a piece of captured starlight. But something strange happened when I brought it back to the village. Everyone started falling asleep, one by one. Even I'm getting drowsy. I've hidden the stone in the old oak tree on the village green, inside the hollow where owls nest. Maybe that will keep it safe. I hope when I wake up tomorrow everything will be back to normal. Poor Halimir. He never understood that his theft had triggered the very curse the stone was meant to prevent. He fell asleep, still believing that a night's rest would solve everything. Fedor and I rushed to the village green, where the ancient oak tree stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Sure enough, there was a hollow in the trunk, just large enough for an owl to nest comfortably. And there, wrapped in an oiled cloth that had somehow kept it perfectly preserved for a century, was the guardian stone. Oh, my dear traveler, I wish you could have seen it. The stone was roughly the size of a man's fist, perfectly spherical, and it seemed to contain its own internal light. Not harsh or bright, but gentle and steady, like moonlight captured in crystal. When I held it in my hands, I could feel the ancient magic thrumming through it, protective spells woven by druids who had understood the deep connections between the land and its people. We knew what had to be done. The journey back up the mountain took place by torchlight, and it was treacherous work navigating the steep paths in darkness. But neither Fedor nor I wanted to wait until morning. The people of Valdris had been sleeping for 100 years already, and every moment felt precious. When we reached the cave chamber, I placed the guardian stone back on its pedestal with all the reverence such an ancient artifact deserved. The moment it touched the stone surface, the entire chamber began to glow with that same gentle, moon-like light. The symbols on the walls seemed to shimmer and pulse, as if the very mountain was sighing with relief. I could feel the protective magic spreading outward from this place, flowing down the mountainside like invisible water, seeking the village that had been lost to darkness for so long. We made our way back down the mountain as quickly as we safely could, both of us anxious to see if our actions had been successful. Dawn was breaking over the peaks as we entered the valley, and already we could hear something that had been absent for 100 years. Voices, the sound of people waking up, calling to each other in confusion and wonder, children crying for their mothers, mothers calling for their children. The babel of 92 people, all trying to understand what had happened to them simultaneously. What followed was perhaps the most joyous chaos I have ever witnessed. Imagine, if you will, an entire village waking up from what felt to them like a single night's sleep, only to discover that the world had changed around them in ways both subtle and profound. Their clothes had somehow remained fresh and clean, their food unspoiled, their homes exactly as they had left them. But the trees in the forest had grown larger, new paths had been worn by the feet of hunters and travelers. And most confusing of all, there were two strangers in their village, an old wizard and a grizzled hunter, who seemed to know far more about their situation than they did. It fell to me to explain what had happened. though I did so as gently as possible. The hardest part was telling Halamir's parents that their son's curiosity had caused the curse, but that his actions had also led us to the solution. The young man himself was mortified when he understood what his theft had cost his community, but his parents and neighbors were forgiving souls who understood that mistakes made in youth shouldn't define a person forever. The village celebrated that night with a feast unlike any they had ever held before. Tables were brought out into the village square, every family contributing whatever they could from their mysteriously preserved stores. There was music and dancing, storytelling and laughter that echoed off the mountainsides until well past midnight. Fedor and I were made guests of honor, though we both felt somewhat awkward about being celebrated for correcting a disaster that might never have happened if we had been there 100 years earlier to prevent it. But the people of Valdris would hear none of our modest protests. To them, we were the heroes who had given them back their lives. I stayed in Valdris for several more days, helping the villagers adjust to their strange situation and ensuring that the protective magic was firmly re-established. The Guardian Stone, now back in its proper place, would continue to shield the valley from dark magic for centuries to come. When it came time for me to leave, the farewells were bittersweet. These people had become dear to me in a very short time, and I knew that despite their warm invitations to visit again, the chances of my finding this hidden valley a second time were quite small. The mountains have their own ways of revealing and concealing their secrets. Fedor walked with me to the edge of the valley, carrying his hunting gear and ready to return to his familiar routines. We had become close friends during our adventure, bound together by the shared experience of waking a village from its 100-year sleep. "You know," he said as we paused at the crest of the hill that would take me back toward the main mountain paths, "I've been hunting these mountains for 40 years, and I thought I'd seen everything they had to offer, but this was something else entirely." I agreed wholeheartedly. In all my long years and countless adventures, few experiences had been as profound as watching an entire community return to life, seeing families reunited with themselves across a century of lost time. We shook hands there on the mountainside, two old friends parting ways but carrying the memory of shared wonder. I never saw Fedor again, though I sometimes wonder if he continued his guardianship of the valley, checking on the people of Valdris from time to time to ensure their continued well-being. And so, my dear traveler, that is the tale of the village that slept for 100 years, and how a young man's curiosity, a hunter's knowledge, and a much younger me combined to restore what had been lost to time. There are lessons in this story, I suppose, though I've never been one to preach or point out morals too obviously. Perhaps it's simply this, that actions have consequences, sometimes far beyond what we can imagine. Young Halimir never intended to curse his entire village, but his theft of the Guardian Stone did exactly that. Yet there's hope in the tale as well. No curse is permanent. No mistake is beyond redemption. Sometimes what's needed is simply someone willing to listen, to investigate, to care enough about strangers to help them find their way back to the light. The fire is growing low now, and even these old eyes are beginning to feel heavy. The tea has worked its familiar magic, warming me from within and reminding me that sleep, when it comes naturally, is one of life's greatest gifts. I hope this tale has brought you some peace, dear friend. Whether you're settling in for a night's rest or simply taking a moment's respite from the day's challenges, remember the people of Valdris, how they faced their bewildering situation with courage and forgiveness, how they celebrated their return to the world with joy and gratitude. Rest well, traveler. Tomorrow brings new adventures, new stories, new possibilities. And should you ever find yourself lost in the mountains, following a thin column of smoke toward an unknown destination, remember that sometimes getting lost is simply the first step toward finding something wonderful. The fire will burn safely through the night, casting its warm light on the stone walls and keeping the autumn chill at bay. Sleep comes easily in this cozy place, and dreams, well, dreams are the best stories of all.